Hello. You will see that the topic that I chose is the effects of man training on problem behavior in individuals with developmental disabilities. The participant, her name is Adrian. She's a 6-year-old little girl. She has a diagnosis of autism, and she does not use words to communicate, considering her to be non-vocal. She does exhibit physical aggression and self-injurious behavior, specifically in the form of biting and hitting others for physical aggression, self-injurious behavior for hitting hard items hard enough to leave a bruise on her hand. What I wanted to find out with this intervention is, can man training decrease problem behavior? And through research in journals, there was a lot of evidence to support this, that this is possible, specifically with problem behavior, introduction of this communication skill. I did conduct a functional behavior assessment to find that the hypothesis of the function of this behavior is attention and access. Specifically with attention, it was, she's a small child and requires the adult, the support of someone to assist her in the access. So it kind of went hand in hand. So looking at a replacement behavior and a skill to teach this child, I did look at a communication assessment next. That did result in seeing that she does have the skills, the matching skills to move forward with icon training. This was socially valid and is socially valid as communication and making requests does promote independence, leads to more quality of life and clearer communication, with potentially the reduction of problem behavior, reduces the intensive service delivery and more inclusion within ultimately her community. When we look at the method, starting with the design, I did choose to use a multiple baseline design across settings. The settings that I chose were primarily where and when and who she spends the most time with. So I did this with during ABA sessions at home, with parents outside of ABA sessions at home, and within the classroom. The independent variable being the man training, and the dependent variables being physical aggression and self-injurious behavior. For data collection, I simply used a sheet and targeted 4 different preferred items. A few of those were food items. One of those was bubbles. So it was bubbles, goldfish, granola bars, and hot tamales. Now I used frequency data to track her physical aggression and the self-injurious behavior. With each time she successfully completed a transfer, I indicated what item it was for and what type of prompt it was used. Now, of course, that was an intervention. Within baseline, there were no prompts used, and simply the icons were made available to her. They were placed out, and if she successfully completed a transfer, we indicated that that was one on the for frequency. That was one completed transfer. Now, in baseline, whether she could discriminate or not, it was really unknown. We just saw that she had the interest in grabbing the icons. So the procedures during baseline, as I mentioned, they did simply look like her successfully, if she successfully grabbed an icon and handed it to an adult or a nearby person, it was 1 in frequency. And we could see that she, according to the graphs, that she was able to do that a couple of times in baseline. Now, this was unprompted. In intervention, we were using prompts. So we did, we used a gestural, a verbal, and 3 to 4 basic prompts to get her to complete the successful transfer. in baseline for the physical aggression and the self-injurious behavior, that was done through my observation. So I'd observe her in the classroom, and I'd go and I'd observe her at home. And then I'd also observe her during my time with her and count how many times she was physically aggressing or engaging in self-injurious behavior. With that being said, during intervention, the data for the problem behavior is only tracked during the times of actually teaching her the man training. It was not necessarily outside of the man training. So these were during sessions, or what considered to be sessions. So I myself conducted the Icon Man training for the ABA sessions at home. For the home with parents, how I moved forward with that was I provided an informal training on data collection and icon training. So using a multiple baseline, this is why I started my phase first. I wanted to model how to do this for the parents as well. And so for the classroom, I did go and I spoke with the teacher, demonstrated this for her, and provided an informal training on the data collection and the training itself. So, and they were to provide data sheets at the end of each week, which was fairly successful in that. The graphs, as I mentioned, we use the multiple baseline across settings. We wanted to see ultimately, as we're intervening and implementing the man training, if we're going to see a reduction in problem behavior across various settings, or if we're going to see a decrease in one setting, an increase in another setting. What is this going to look like across the board? And so that led us to the question of course, will man training decrease problem behavior? That was ideally what we wanted to know. So we had to look at these different settings and look at intervention as well. So for physical aggression, the graph you'll see on the very left, we started that with ABA at the home. I took baseline across 3 sessions, then I started my intervention. We took baseline at home with parents for 5 sessions, and then we started intervention. We took baseline data in the classroom for 7 sessions before we started the intervention. And so I was able to go in and observe all of these environments and take the baseline data. That was not a problem. You'll see that the x-axis represents frequency for self-injurious behavior, physical aggression behavior, and icon training. Each time she completes a successful transfer, that's 1 data point during a session. And then the x-axis, that was the y-axis, the x-axis represents the sessions. So how many separate times, separate days were these sessions, these trainings conducted? So during baseline, what we saw was Adrian did complete 1 to 2 icon transfers without prompting. She either was interested or she was somewhat familiar with the idea. I didn't necessarily see her reach for an item associated with it, but she did complete the transfer, which was really good information because it showed that, it could potentially be a successful intervention. Adrian did complete up to 9 successful mans in 1 ABA session, and that was out of 10 trials, with, as we're seeing, corresponding decreases. That's when we get to session 13 or 14, and we'll see across the board as we look at physical aggression, we see a decreasing trend in our ABA at home, and we do see a decreasing trend in our self-injurious behavior, with it being relatively stable with 0, and then coming up at 1, and being fairly minimal in that area. We do see at home with parents, we can see that the man training, we see a fairly steady increase. She's continuing to get better with her icon transfers, continuing to request items. We do see her physical aggression kind of start out at 2 per session or 2 per period of time that they're implementing these icons, interventions. However, the data shows that there's, a decrease, increase, decrease, and increase kind of across the board. And we're kind of ending the sessions all together around the same amount of problem behavior with 2 per session. So that could mean a number of things. But it's good that it's not increasing. We do see with the classroom, with the icon man training, we've seen that her man training starts out, by the time it gets to the last setting, she's actually requesting more in the beginning of those sessions than she was even during those ABA sessions, so I'm hopeful that we're starting to see that generalization to other settings already. However, we see a little bit of an increase, decrease, kind of inconsistency in the data. And as we fade out or end where we're at right now, we're at the same level of frequency with requests. So, but when we look at our problem behavior, we can also see that our problem behavior struggles with stability. We do see physical aggression being fairly high in the beginning, with four instances of physical aggression in the beginning, and then it leveling off with 3 in the end. And there may be a reason for that, maybe because there's a variety of personalities, many kids. It's a little bit more difficult to conduct an intervention when you're working with a bunch of other little kids as well. Antecedent manipulation can go into that. So that's kind of those kinds of things taken into consideration. We do see that there was a decrease in her self-injurious behavior overall in the classroom as well. So overall, in each setting, we did see that there was a functional relation with the man training and the physical aggression and self-injurious behavior. And there was improvement. We saw more improvement in more of a contrived setting during ABA, but overall, in reality, if ABA were to fade out, we do see this being a successful intervention that parents and teachers can continue to implement. Maybe slow process, but it can be a successful process. So, identifying what those barriers could potentially be, as we talked about, there's a lot of kids in the classroom, also home with parents. They could be tired, they could be not implementing as many trials. Data could be skewed because I'm not taking the data in those other settings, that they're giving it to me and I'm graphing that indirect, data, that reporting. So there are various number of barriers and the potential limitations to seeing to the fidelity of this intervention altogether. However, if I were to do it over again, and what would I do differently? Really, I would talk to the teacher and the parents more about antecedent manipulation, maybe most appropriate times of day, maybe altering the classroom as easiest as possible, coming up with ideas and maybe bringing those materials in with the family, again, modeling that and just cutting that work in half. As we show in our data, this was successful. So I think also breaking down and showing them the data that this did work. So as we get this far in, wow, this did work, maybe, they'd have more buy-in and be willing to work through it. Because obviously problem behavior is not fun to deal with all the time. So just getting that second wind in for them. But obviously challenges across the settings, could be that there was inconsistency in implementation and data collection. It's something that happens a lot in those antecedent strategies, and increased check-ins on my part would always be helpful. So we definitely do see that this is effective, and this was effective with this little girl. And it's good to see that this evidence-based practice worked. Thank you so much.